Dr. Betty Clarkson stared at the referral form on her tablet, her coffee growing cold beside her. In 15 years of sleep medicine, she'd never seen a case quite like this. Jessica Marshall, age 32, no prior history of sleep disorders, suddenly experiencing severe parasomnia. But it was the nurse's additional notes that made Betty's skin prickle. Patient report episodes began precisely at 2:47 a.m. each night, 3 weeks ago after moving into her grandmother's Victorian house. The sleep lab was unusually quiet tonight. Betty had worked hundreds of night shifts, but something about the hollow silence between the beeps of the monitoring equipment felt different. Wrong somehow. As she helped Jessica settle into the observation room, Betty noticed how the young woman's hands trembled while they discussed her symptoms. There were dark circles under her eyes, so deep they looked almost like bruises. "The sleepwalking isn't the worst part," Jessica whispered, flinching as Betty attached the cold electrodes to her temples. "It's the humming. Always the same lullaby, every night. At first I thought I was doing it myself, but..." She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers, bringing up a recording. "My partner filmed me during one episode. Listen." Betty pressed play. Through the phone's speakers came a sound that made her blood run cold. A melody that seemed to dance on the edge of recognition, like a half-remembered dream. But in the video, Jessica's mouth remained firmly closed. "I've heard this before," Betty muttered, though she couldn't remember where. Something from her residency, perhaps, buried in old case files. Once Jessica was prepped and settled, Betty retreated to the monitoring station. The bank of screens cast a sickly glow across her face as she watched Jessica's vital signs, brainwave patterns, and video feed. Everything looked normal as Jessica drifted off to sleep, but Betty couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. At 2:47 a.m., the first anomaly appeared, a slight fluctuation in the delta waves. Nothing most doctors would worry about. But Betty had specialized in unusual sleep phenomena during her residency. This pattern, she'd seen it only once before, in a classified case study from 1973, a study she wasn't supposed to know about. The temperature in the observation room dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the window. The infrared camera showed Jessica lying perfectly still, but the audio pickup was detecting something that made Betty's hand shake. That same lullaby from Jessica's recording, growing stronger by the second. Betty reached for her phone to call her colleague at the university, but her hand froze mid-motion as she noticed something horrifying on the video feed. The timestamp was still running, but Jessica's chest had stopped rising and falling. For exactly 6 minutes and 27 seconds, there were no vital signs at all. Then Jessica's eyes snapped open, and she sat up with an unnatural rigidity. The EEG showed she was still in deep sleep, deeper than any normal human sleep state. The humming grew louder, becoming a chorus of voices that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Betty's fingers hovered over the emergency call button as she watched Jessica's mouth. It remained firmly closed, even as the lullaby, ancient and somehow familiar, filled the room. With growing horror, Betty realized the sound wasn't coming from Jessica at all. It was coming from the empty space beside her bed. The EEG started displaying impossible patterns, not the usual waves of human sleep, but perfect geometric shapes spinning and morphing like a digital mandala. Betty's eyes darted between the monitors as every piece of equipment in the room began registering activity that defied explanation. Through the observation window, she watched as Jessica's body rose from the bed, hovering several inches above the mattress. The humming had transformed into a chorus of voices, all singing in a language that made Betty's head spin when she tried to comprehend it. Then Jessica's head turned, not toward the window, but a full 180 degrees toward the corner of the room. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and in the infrared feed, Betty saw why. The camera was capturing a mass of heat signatures, dozens of them, all in the shape of human bodies, crowded around Jessica's suspended form. Betty slammed the emergency button and sprinted toward the observation room. As she reached for the door handle, the power went out. In the 3 seconds it took for the backup generators to kick in, the humming stopped. When the lights came back on, Jessica was back in bed, sleeping peacefully. Her vitals were normal. The EEG showed standard sleep patterns. There was no evidence of anything unusual, except for a single line of text that had appeared on every monitoring screen.
Thank you for returning her to us. She's the seventh.
The next morning, Betty discovered that in 1973, 6 other patients had disappeared from various sleep clinics across the country. Each had been sleeping in rooms that were once part of Victorian houses. Each had reported hearing humming before they vanished. And each had been exactly 32 years old.